Is Mexico more dangerous than the USA? If you ask the people that left these comments on my other videos, they would say yes. Comments like, Mexico is a failed state, run by no one other than the cartels. You know nothing of the reality that Mexico lives every day. Another one is, Mexico is a third world country. It's just a failed state because of the cartels. And another one, Mexico is a narco state. They don't have a country. Their country is owned and run by the cartel. They are and have always been oppressed by their government. The others are way too long to read, but there are a few of them that I get over and over again. Like, Mexico is a failed state, all police and government in Mexico are corrupt, and I wouldn't go there if you paid me. Now, if you were looking at the national homicide rate, yeah, it makes Mexico look much more dangerous. But what if I told you that that's only part of the picture? But what if I told you the USA might be more of a threat to the world and its own people than Mexico could ever be? Now, I'm not here to defend crime or say that these things don't happen in Mexico and there aren't parts of Mexico that are dangerous. Mexico has its problems, and the problems are obvious. Every country has problems. But the thing is that after living here for more than 2 years, the way that people talk about Mexico and the way that they ignore what's going on in the USA, it's a little twisted and racist. So there's the argument, but Mexico has more murders than the USA. It does. Now, recently, Mexico's homicide rate has been between 17.5 to 23 people per 100,000 people. That's very high. And in the USA, the homicide rate's around 5 or 6 per 100,000 people. So there's a big difference there. But the thing is, to understand the homicide rate and the connection to safety that has, it actually helps to look past the total numbers of each country, because that doesn't give you all the facts that you need. You have to see who's involved and where this violence is happening. Here's the big elephant in the room. Most homicides in Mexico are not random. They're actually targeted at specific people. There's an estimate that says 65% to 80% of murders in Mexico are linked to organized crime. That makes a big difference. That means that most of the violence is between rival gangs fighting over territory or gang clashes with military or police. So if you're not involved in the drug trade or organized crime, your chances of being murdered drop big time. So the thing about the national rate is that the violence in Mexico is highly concentrated in certain areas. It isn't spread evenly across the country, just like the USA. A huge portion of the violence happens in specific states, and more specifically inside some towns that are border towns within those states, where gangs fight for control of smuggling routes to get into the US. And there are many parts of Mexico that have similar or even lower homicide rates than major cities in the USA, like the Yucatan. Yucatan is considered a very safe state and has a lower homicide rate than many safe states in the USA. If you remove the war between the cartel and the government, the picture of an average resident and a tourist changes. So when you remove that, Mexico's homicide rate drops to 3.5 to 4.4 per 100,000 people, which is very similar to the US rate. If you remove the gang-related and organized crime areas, that those things happen in the US also. So once you remove the drug war, the violence that's fueled by drugs, a normal, everyday, law-abiding citizen of Mexico face the exact same risks as a citizen of the USA. But then people say that Americans are in danger in Mexico. But statistically, if you're a US citizen, you're safer in Mexico than you are back home. The homicide rate for American tourists or American citizens here is 2.1 per 100,000 people. That's half of the rate than it is back home in the USA. The most normal people live in neighborhoods and visit cities where the homicide rates are low. Like I said, that high national average is pulled up by this extreme violence. And it does exist. But while Mexico's violence is dominated by gangs, the US violence is more mixed. Only about 13 to 15% of US homicides are officially classified as gang related. And interestingly enough, for some of you out there, Mexico has lower rates of non-violent crimes that are reported, like home break-ins or car thefts. And saying that the police are corrupt in Mexico and acting like there aren't corrupt police in the USA, it's completely outrageous. In a middle-class Mexican neighborhood like one in Mexico City or Merida, the vibe isn't war. It's just everyday normal life. People are walking dogs, eating at street stalls at nighttime, and going on dates and hanging out with their family. But if you compare that to many US cities that are just have hollowed out downtown areas because the streets feel unsafe, because of homelessness and a huge drug crisis, like it's a big contrast. And yet, if you ask me which one feels more dangerous if you have kids, I know the answer for me and my family. Let's not forget that the US has this huge phenomenon of random mass violence. Violence that happens in schools, malls, and theaters. Like if I was a parent in America, I'd be afraid to let my kids out because you never know what's going to happen. And here in Mexico, there's horrific violence, yes, but it's hardly ever random. There's no school shooters. Like in which country is a child more likely to practice a lockdown at school? And then there's fentanyl. It's killed over 80,000 Americans in the last year alone. It's turned parts of major cities like San Francisco, Philadelphia, or Seattle into these zones that feel like apocalyptic movies. Yeah, Mexico is a transit point for these substances, but it doesn't have the same level of drug consumption as the USA. Mexico might supply the business, but the USA has the addiction, the social decay. They're both not good whatsoever, but which one affects everyday life more? So I have to ask, where do you think you would be more likely to face violence for just being in the wrong place at the wrong time? So I feel like living in Mexico has really opened my eyes to the truth. It's actually completely different than I thought growing up, watching movies and TV and news. I did know that the world wasn't the way it seemed or the way that we've been told. But moving here and realizing that Mexico is a completely different place than I thought it was made me question the world more than I ever did before. And then the other day I watched the video and it made me step back even further. And I realized that there's more to this Mexico is dangerous thing than I ever thought. That it wasn't just about street safety or murder rates. And it really got me thinking. Now I'm going to share the video with you right now.
So the United States is the most violent nation on earth, the biggest environmental destructor, the sponsor of every crisis from drug cartels in South America, to fossil fuel corporations destroying our oceans, to AI data centers consuming all our drinking water, to the military-industrial complex trying to pulverize Palestine and Iran to dust and ashes.
Now that was Tripoli. He has a podcast that I really enjoy about politics and history. He starts off by stating that the US is the most violent nation on earth. That's a big statement, but is he wrong? He first shows a map of countries that the US has bombed since World War II. They've bombed, missile strike, or used force of combat in over 30 countries since the end of the war in 1945. Then he shows a chart that explains this, that the US military produces a huge amount of pollution. Every single year, it releases more carbon emissions than entire countries like Sweden, Denmark, and Portugal. That's just the US military. Then he claims that it's the sponsor of every crisis in the world, from drug cartels to oil companies and data centers destroying the environment, and how they also support the military-industrial complex that's trying to pulverize Palestine and Iran to dust. Is he wrong? But wait, that wasn't all that he had to say. There's more.
The United States is the biggest creator of refugees in the world. It funds every war from Ukraine to Congo to Sudan to Myanmar, making billions of dollars in war profiteering while stealing the resources of destabilized regions to make US corporations richer.
He puts up this chart to show that 1 in 67 people in the world are displaced, and that the US has the biggest responsibility for this, not because they're directly the cause of these problems, but because they fund every single war that goes on with weapons and money, sometimes even supplying both sides. And at the same time that these wars are going on, they go into these destabilized regions and steal resources. And what that does is help giant US corporations make more money. I mean, they're not even hiding it anymore. The US recently went into Venezuela and admitted it went in there for oil. But he says even more in the video.
The United States is not only the biggest instigator of violence in the world, it is also the single biggest barrier to world peace, as it continues to veto every single UN resolution that seeks to stabilize global politics and build international momentum for improving human rights and safety.
He says that the US has used its veto power in the UN from stopping Israel, basically. There are 5 permanent members on the UN Council: China, France, Russia, the UK, and the US. And they have this veto power that they can block any resolution or anything, no matter what the other countries or other members have anything to say. They can just block it and that's it. And that's why he says that the US is the biggest barrier to world peace. Then he shows this chart and explains that they don't just vote against the stabilization of global politics, but also improving human rights and safety. This map shows that when the UN voted to make food a human right around the world, only Israel and the USA voted no. That's wild to think, isn't it? It's sad. Oh, and you guessed it. There's even more. I'm not gonna lie, I really like his content.
And on top of all of this, the United States shows absolutely no interest in improving the lives of anyone, as millions of the United States' own citizens die of hunger, drown in medical debt, or join the growing millions of prisoners that serve as de facto slave labor for US corporations.
Then he goes on to show things like how the US doesn't even want to improve the lifestyle of its own citizens. He says that millions of people are affected, especially by these 3 things. The first thing is this chart that pops up. It says that food insecurity is increasing in the heartland of America. The heartland is usually the Midwest, a region where farming, factories, and traditional values have existed for a long time. The next chart that pops up is one that shows a graph that the people in the United States owe at least $220 billion on medical debt. Only about 51% of people in America are cost secure, meaning that they can actually afford their healthcare and medicine. And the third thing was this, a map of the US states that use prisons for profit. And he basically says that it's slave labor for US corporations. And I agree with him. See, there's a thing in the USA called the 13th Amendment, and it allows involuntary servitude as punishment for a crime. Basically, for-profit prisons can legally force people to work in prison for little to no pay, allowing private companies and public companies, huge corporations, to make a ridiculous amount of money off these people. Now, the chart at the bottom says that not only that the data is unavailable for Washington, D.C., but it doesn't include immigration detention facilities. In this video, he doesn't even have the time to mention the profiteering of immigrants, from paying them nothing to profiting off police forces like ICE and immigration holding facilities. I've talked about those things in other videos though. So I'll put the link in the description and you can go watch them later if you want. And all of this, it sets up Tripoli's end of the video.
Now, I say all this to bring us to one extremely important point. The future of humanity is entirely incompatible with the survival of the United States. And it is now an objective fact that the only way the children of this world have any chance of a bright future on a habitable planet is if the United States as a political entity is entirely dismantled. It is abundantly clear at this point that the capitalists that run the United States would rather destroy the world than give up their wealth and power. So it is simply a question then of whether the united working class of the world will stop them before they do. Anyway, something to think about.
Now, whether you agree with him or not, it raises a bigger question. How do we define dangerous? Do we only define it to what's convenient for our situation and what makes us feel better so we can sleep at night? Or is it also war influence, economic instability, drug crises, environmental harm, corporations that are bigger than they should be, and mental health violence? I'm not saying that Mexico is perfect, because it's far from perfect. And I'm not saying that the US is terrible. I'm saying that we've been told a story about these 2 places our whole lives. And it's not even the whole picture. 99% of Mexico is just like 99% of the US. Good people just trying to survive. The world isn't dangerous because of your neighbor. It's dangerous because of the 1% who take everything from everyone else. I don't care if it's an organized crime group or a billion-dollar corporation. They're the ones out there fueling the conflict. And the rest of us are just trying to live and survive. Now, if you like this video, I think you'll enjoy Tripoli's podcast. He puts a lot of work into it, and I think he does a great job. I put the link in the description below, so go check him out. Also, I have a bunch of other videos that you would like too, like this one right here. This one's called, Why Are Americans So Terrified of Mexico? Here's the reality. Click it, go watch it, I'll see you there, and thanks for watching this video.